One Man's Garden Railways, read by the author Charles Carson. Chapter 1. Burney's Bog Railway. It was the copy of Model Engineer magazine that I picked up from the newsstand in Euston Station, London in 1962 that started my lifelong interest in garden railways. Married in 1964, my wife Anne generously allowed the expenditure of meagre funds on a new Myford ML7 lathe and an 8-foot by 6-foot garden shed to put it in. The shed was erected in the back garden of our first home in Listannon Avenue, Whitehead, County Antrim, with mains electricity fed by an extension cable from the house. It was clad with cedar weatherboarding that gave off a pleasant aroma in the heat of the summer sun. The lathe cost £83 10 from A.J. Reeves and Company of Birmingham and was paid for in 3 instalments. That same lathe is still in use half a century and several railways later. My late father was then a skilled jig and tool fitter employed by Short Brothers and Harlan's aircraft manufacturers. He took an immediate interest in my new acquisition. Soon he was turning parts for the construction of a 5-inch gauge locomotive. It was to be powered by a 2-stroke petrol engine obtained from a power-assisted bicycle, see Plate 1. The crankshaft drove 2 dynamos via V-belts. One was a 12-volt car dynamo for traction power, and the other was a 6-volt motorcycle dynamo for the field excitation of the former. Forced air cooling was provided by an electric motor-driven fan in a sheet metal housing enclosing the cylinder. Current from the dynamo was fed to a motor mounted longitudinally in the chassis and drove 2 4-wheel bogies via shafts with universal joints. The bogie axles were coupled together by chains. Driving that locomotive was a delight. First the engine throttle was opened and then the field current rheostat was advanced. This was accompanied by the sound of the revolutions reducing as the dynamo loaded the engine and the train smoothly took off. A superb stainless steel body riveted together and complete with windows, lights and a 2-tone horn completed the locomotive. See Plate 11. My father passed away in 1981, but his diesel-electric locomotive still runs on the racetrack of the Model Engineering Society of Northern Ireland, MESNI, at their Cultraw venue. By January 1968 we had moved our growing family to Carroll Hill Road, Glengormley, County Antrim. This was a new semi-detached bungalow on a development built on the site of Burney's Bog, arguably one of the coldest places in Ireland in the winter time. Proof that it was indeed an ancient bog appeared as large pieces of black oak were found on the undeveloped ground in front of our home. The workshop shed was re-erected on a concrete foundation provided for a small payment by the developers' builders who were still on site. Later we aspired to a brick-built garage, greatly increasing workshop and domestic storage space. It never accommodated our car. Soon thoughts turned to building my first railway. No streamlined record-breaking trains for me, however. Ride-on rackety narrow gauge with sharp radius curves was my thing. Above all, I wanted to see the world from the perspective of the driver, with eyes 3 feet above the track. A track that guided one through a time tunnel into another dimension. A phenomenon that actually seemed to happen, especially at night with a dim headlamp and a couple of pints of home brew consumed. It has often been remarked that we garden railway enthusiasts belong to a very broad church. I found myself a bit to the east of model engineering and far to the south of Engage. There was little enthusiasm for gardening, since it always appeared that preparations needed to have been made months prior to planting. Although still wanting to run in the great outdoors, there were never going to be miniature forests of sculptured upland lawns. Unable to afford ready-made ride-on locomotives and track, it was to be a do-it-yourself operation. The focus was to be on minimum cost with maximum enjoyment. Although appearances would be important, there would be no rivet counting, so even though most model engineers of 50 years ago required 5-inch gauge railways to be elevated for stability reasons, the decision was taken to settle for a 5-inch gauge ground level track. This meant an oval of 30 foot by 20 foot could be accommodated in the back garden, with a siding into the new detached garage. See plate 2. The track was made from black iron inch by quarter inch flats and 3/8 inch diameter spacers with turned down ends riveted in place. A very rigid track resulted, which greatly reduced civil engineering work on the uneven surface of the garden. Very few supports were needed. Some people buy a ready-to-run or a kit locomotive out of a catalogue. Others purchase plans and castings to make one for themselves. However, the odd person simply consults the scrap box and a few magazine articles and builds out of their head. It so happens that there was an ex-government surplus aircraft flat motor and a dubious 12-volt car battery on the garage shelf, so that was okay. All that was needed was the rest. The general appearance was simply determined as it was going to be an electric 040 locomotive with the battery under the bonnet and the driver's cab behind. Anticipating many years of arduous service on imaginary narrow gauge lines in Ireland's gardens, it was considered important to have a proper chassis. Normal model engineering principles were followed in that frames were hacksawed and filed from quarter-inch thick black iron, complete with openings for axle boxes. A seriously arduous task. Whereas nowadays CNC waterjet cutting machines can cheaply profile any shape with practically no need for finishing. Before proceeding further, some elementary mathematics were needed to work out the necessary gearing to achieve a reasonable speed on the track. What was required was a stately progress through the landscape of say around 4 miles per hour. Even in the days when health and safety was unheard of, one wanted to avoid damage due to youthful speedsters derailing on curves. The motor plate stated that the speed was 1500 RPM at 24 volts, say 750 RPM at 12 volt, without reduction gearing. Since the diameter of the proposed wheels was to be 3.5 inches, the circumference therefore would be pi times 3.5 inches, equaling near enough 11 inches. At 750 RPM, the wheel would be traversing 750 times 11 equals 8,250 inches of track per minute. This equates to 7.81 miles per hour. To achieve the desired maximum speed of 4 miles per hour, therefore, a reduction ratio of 2 to 1 was required. 4 wheels were turned from 3.5 inch diameter steel bar and fitted to the axles. This fitting was a nerve-wracking business in those days before metal glue such as Loctite. Having achieved axle and wheel bore dimensions alleged to give an interference fit, the wheel was heated by use of a propane torch and the axle cooled in the fridge. Then the two were assembled. Nowadays one hears much of white coat syndrome affecting blood pressure readings in the doctor's surgery, but little of shop coat syndrome afflicting those attempting to assemble wheels and axles in the home workshop. Unless all the parameters are correct, interference fit, hot enough wheel, cold enough axle, speed of bringing them together, and a sober mechanic equipped with leather gloves, although not so sober that he or she fails to attempt the operation, the following results may be obtained. The axle completely refuses to enter the wheel bore even when persuasion is attempted with a heavy mallet. Next to complete and immediate success, this is probably the next best result. The recommended procedure to follow in this case is a beverage of your choice, followed by an early night and a retry the following day. With the offending parameter adjusted, victory should be achieved. Highly undesirable is the situation when the axle half enters the wheel and totally refuses to advance a millimetre, or a few thou on the old money. Regardless of violent persuasion by the heavy mallet aided by enraged vocal encouragement. With the wheel sets completed, it was back to the main locomotive construction. The reduction ratio was to be achieved by worm and pinion gearing, the worm gear mounted on the motor shaft. One disadvantage of this arrangement was to become obvious later. When the part of the motor was cut, the train could not coast under its own momentum due to the pinion wheel being unable to drive the worm wheel. On the other hand, Power reduction produced an effective braking action. A controller handle managed direction and speed of the engine. This swung a phosphor bronze wiper over stud contacts made from 4BA cheesehead brass screws and nuts. These were arranged in an arc through holes in a Paxton panel. Movement of the handle introduced or cut out high wattage series resistors, homemade from old storage heater elements, connected between the studs. The locomotive sported cast bronze nameplates on either side of the bonnet, which read BBC. See plate 3, where scale driver Caroline is at the controls. This quaint device resulted from finding the plates from an old discarded studio microphone at the BBC, where I was on the staff as an engineer at that time. The cab was made from wood with a curved sheet metal roof and painted sky blue. Spectacle frames were lid rims from coca tins with the centres removed. A complementary yellow was used for the chassis, dark blue for the bonnet and dark red for the axle boxes. The choice of colours was dictated not so much by artistic design but more by the remnants of domestic paints on the garage shelf. The front grille was made from expanded sheet steel and the working headlamp a bullseye lens mounted in a shoe polish tin. No garden railway is complete without a station as a focus for train ride activities. This one evolved as seen in plate 4, where BBC is halted in Burney's Bog station with pretty Gillian Jennings perched on the driving truck. Eldest son Andrew is the ticket collector. Note the hand-painted nameplate illuminated by a low-voltage bulb in an upside-down jam jar mounted on a bracket on top of the post. Station fencing made from pointed wooden laths seemed to be supported by the uprights being jammed in the holes of leftover building bricks. By the year of this photograph, 1973, the contents of the wooden workshop had been moved into the back of the garage. My ML7 lathe is just visible in the left-hand window. Unseen in the picture but hiding below the right-hand window is a brassed iron-framed upright piano. If one imagines setting off from the station, the track curved to the left over the garage siding points and then traversed a bridge over a garden pond. In the dusk of one memorable summer's evening, consumption of home-brewed beer combined with enthusiastic playing from the garage piano led to passengers aboard a night special train being deposited in the pool. The brassed piano had an eventful journey ahead of it before it reached its final resting place, high on a drumlin in County Down. Occasionally BBC appeared at the racetrack of the MESNI at Cultraw. This attractive venue was, and still is, inside the wall garden of a demolished big house called Dalcoonan, which reputedly was the childhood home of my great-grandmother. See plate 5. Mind you, there were also family rumours of skeletons in the cupboard, and an alleged elopement with the gardener. The site is part of the Folk and Transport Museum complex. Plate 6 shows BBC on this track in the wall garden during Whitsun 1972. On board, behind Andrew at the throttle, are myself and my mother. The years passed quickly in Glengormley, and with an increasing family, our 750 square foot bungalow began to seem a little cramped for space. In January 1974, we moved to a new life on a windy hill in Carricknadarragh, County Down. Suffice to say that building railways and model engineering activities were out of necessity curtailed as my wife and I tackled the transformation of a derelict farmhouse into a home. However, one attempt was made to make it easier to keep running at the MESNI track at Cultraw, namely BAT. BAT was my second battery electric locomotive, see plate 7. It was loosely based on industrial locomotives as used in mines and factories. Although not a thing of beauty, indeed one child onlooker at Cultraw was overheard telling his father, "That's not a rail train." BAT possessed certain advantages. The weight of a locomotive directly affects the tractive effort, but unfortunately it is also injurious to the back of someone trying to lift it. This type of locomotive used a battery unit that could be swapped with a fully charged one. When the heavy car battery was removed from the motorised chassis, the units could easily be loaded into the car boot, a Mini, for the journey to Cultrow. Instead of axle boxes sliding in slots in the frames, the wheel bearings were mounted at the ends of swinging arms with rubber blocks providing springing. In other ways too, it was a considerable advance on BBC, in that it had a home-constructed electronic speed controller, an ammeter and a battery condition meter. The story of the fraught making of the controller, and particularly the etched printed circuit board, was told in a series of articles entitled Bats in the Belfry. These were published in a series of 3 parts in The Link, the journal of the Model Engineering Society of Northern Ireland.